Welcome to Hungarian Insights, your go-to channel for exploring Hungary's rich history, vibrant culture, and language learning resources. Imagine living in a country where freedom was limited, but life was comfortable enough that real change seemed just out of reach. Today, we're diving into the story of Hungary's Kadar era, the time of goulash communism, national resilience, and a quiet revolution that helped reshape Europe. Let's explore how decades of history set the stage for Hungary's dramatic journey from Soviet control to European integration.
Welcome to another deep dive today. We're going to be talking about a period of Hungarian history that's really interesting, the Kadar era.
Yes.
I have to admit, it's not something I'm super familiar with, but you sent over some great materials.
Oh, it's a fascinating period. This Kadar era, it actually spanned a pretty long time, over 3 decades, and it really shaped Hungary's, path, really set the stage for its transition to democracy, eventually joining the West, all of that.
Wow. Okay, so let's get into this. So we're talking about Hungary post-World War II, a country that had, been through a lot of turmoil. How did this unique system of goulash communism, how did that even emerge?
Well, after the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, which was brutally suppressed by the Soviets, János Kadar came to power.
Right.
And he realized that those hardline, Stalinist policies, they just weren't working. They were really alienating people. The economy was stifled.
So Kadar was like, okay, we need to try something different.
Yeah, exactly. He introduced what became known as goulash communism, this kind of softer, more pragmatic form of communism.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued now. But how did it actually work? Like, did Hungarians all of a sudden have free elections? Multiple parties?
Not quite. I mean, it was still a one-party state, but Kadar, he really focused on improving living standards.
Okay.
So he allowed some private enterprise, made sure that people had more access to consumer goods, even relaxed travel restrictions. It was all about, appeasing the population, trying to create some stability.
So less Iron Curtain, more goulash.
Haha, yeah, you could say that. It was a unique kind of social contract, right? You get limited freedoms in exchange for some economic security. And, to a certain extent, it actually worked. For a lot of Hungarians, life under Kadar, it was genuinely better than what they'd experienced before.
But as you say, this goulash communism, it couldn't last forever. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union itself was on the verge of collapse.
Right.
So how did that impact Hungary?
Oh, those winds of change sweeping across Eastern Europe
Yeah.
definitely reached Hungary. I mean, the economy was starting to stagnate,
Right.
and there was just this growing desire for more political freedom. People saw what was happening in other Soviet bloc countries and thought, hey, we want some of that too.
So then what were some of the key events that led to the regime change in 1990? I mean, was it a violent revolution, or did things kind of unfold more peacefully?
Well, in 1989, the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party, they basically voted themselves out of existence.
Wow.
It's pretty incredible. The country held its first free elections in decades. That was it, a definitive break from communist rule. And, what's really remarkable is that this transition, it happened relatively peacefully.
Sounds like, yeah, a truly pivotal moment in their history, a chance to, totally redefine the nation's path.
Absolutely. And the dismantling of the Iron Curtain between Austria and Hungary, that was such a powerful symbol of this new era. It really opened the door for Hungary to, re-engage with the West, pursue a totally different future.
And that, of course, brings us to Hungary's decision to join NATO and the European Union. What were some of the driving forces behind that?
Well, after, decades of Soviet domination, joining NATO in 1999 and the EU in 2004,
Yeah.
they were seen as strategic moves, trying to ensure security, stability. It was about aligning with Western democracies, becoming part of that European project.
A real departure from that Soviet sphere of influence.
Exactly, exactly. It was a way to guarantee, hopefully, a brighter future for Hungary, free from, the shadows of its communist past and embracing this new era of democracy, European integration.
It really does sound like a complete 180.
It was a dramatic shift. And, joining NATO and the EU, it wasn't just about security and economics.
Oh.
It was about identity, too.
Okay.
After being in the Soviet orbit for so long, Hungary was ready to reclaim its European heritage, reconnect with the West.
It's like they were saying, we're back, we belong here.
Exactly. It was a real declaration of independence, a statement of self-belief.
Yeah, it's amazing to see how a nation's past can really have such a strong influence on its present, on its future.
Yeah, it really can.
And, you mentioned how the Kadar era kind of had this lasting impact on Hungary's trajectory. So how did those experiences under goulash communism, how did they actually shape that transition to democracy?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. On the
Okay.
one hand, Kadar's more pragmatic approach to communism, it did expose Hungarians to at least some elements of a market economy
Right.
and to a slightly more open society, too.
Yeah.
So that might have actually made the transition to a more Western-style democracy a little less jarring, you
So
know?
it was like a stepping stone.
In a way, yeah. But on the other hand, you can't ignore the fact that they lived under a one-party state for decades.
Right.
Even if it was relatively relaxed, it still leaves its mark.
Of course. Yeah.
There's actually a debate among historians about whether, the legacy of goulash communism made Hungarians more or less skeptical of liberal democracy. It's hard to say for sure.
It makes sense. It's complex.
Very complex. And it's important to remember, too, that Hungary has this long and rich history,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
stretching back centuries. And that history, with all its ups and downs, triumphs and tragedies, it's definitely left its mark on the national psyche.
Yeah, you can't really understand a nation's present without understanding its past.
Exactly. I mean, this is a nation that has experienced periods of great power, prosperity,
Mm.
as well as times of hardship, foreign domination. For example, the Treaty of Trianon after World War I,
Oh, right, yeah.
which resulted in significant territorial losses.
Right.
That had profound impact. It really did.
Wait, remind me about the Treaty of Trianon.
Oh, it was signed in 1920, right after World War I.
Okay.
And basically, Hungary ended up losing 2/3 of its territory
Wow.
and a big chunk of its population, too.
That's huge.
It was a huge blow, created this real sense of national trauma that honestly has kind of resonated throughout Hungarian history ever since.
Wow.
Yeah,
So when we're looking at Hungary's choices in the late 20th century, whether it's embracing goulash communism or joining the EU, we need to remember that kind of historical baggage.
absolutely. Yeah. History, it doesn't just shape events, it shapes perceptions, attitudes, fears even.
Right?
And in Hungary's case, I think that sense of historical loss, of vulnerability, it might have contributed to this desire for security, for stability, which joining NATO and the EU, it seemed to offer that.
That's fascinating. It sounds like, the desire to join these organizations, it wasn't just about like the practical stuff, like the security, the economic benefits.
Right.
It was also about this reclaiming a sense of like national identity and belonging in Europe.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. It was this really complex mix of motivations. After decades of being forced into that Soviet orbit, Hungary was just eager to, reassert its European identity, reconnect with its historical and cultural roots.
Okay, so we've talked about goulash communism, the regime change, the historical context, and the factors that led Hungary to join NATO and the EU. It's pretty clear this period had a huge impact on the country.
Oh, definitely.
But what about, like, the legacy of all this turbulent history on contemporary Hungary? How does that play out?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
How have those experiences of the 20th century, especially the Kadar era and the transition to democracy, how have they shaped the political and social landscape of Hungary today?
That's what I'm really curious about. How have these past events, like, influenced the way Hungarians see themselves, and their place in the world?
That's a great question. I think it's really important to remember that the transition to democracy, it's an ongoing process. It's about building a culture of respect for democratic institutions, for the rule of law, and for individual rights and freedoms.
So it's not just like a flip of a switch and everything's different?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
It takes time.
It sounds like there's a lot more to unpack here, about the long-term effects of these historical events.
Oh, absolutely. The Kadar era, the transition to democracy, it's all left a very complex legacy, one that continues to shape Hungary's political and social landscape, even in the 21st century.
Well, you've definitely given our listeners and me a lot to think about. I'm ready to dive even deeper into how those like echoes of the past are shaping the Hungary of today. It's striking how much Hungary's story seems to be about finding its place,
Yeah.
First within that Soviet sphere,
Right.
then with that unique goulash communism,
Uh-huh.
and now as part of the EU.
Yeah, it's a great observation. And joining the EU, that was a huge step for Hungary.
Huge.
It really represented this commitment to democracy, to a market economy, to these shared values with, other European nations.
It was almost like a homecoming, right?
Yeah.
After decades of being on the kind of periphery,
Yeah.
Hungary was finally reintegrating with the West.
Absolutely. It was chance to be a full participant in that European project, to have a voice in shaping the future of the continent. But, it also came with challenges.
Oh, sure.
Hungary, like all the other member states, has had to adapt to EU regulations, compete in a globalized market, and just kind of reconcile national interests with, the demands of being part of this larger entity.
So it's like navigating a whole new set of expectations and responsibilities.
Exactly. And for a nation with such a strong sense of its own history, its own identity,
Right.
this integration process, it can bring up some really complex questions.
Like, how does being Hungarian fit into this larger context of being European? Is there a tension there?
Yeah, that's a question a lot of nations grapple with, not just Hungary. Globalization and integration, they can sometimes feel like threats to national identity,
Yeah.
to those things that make a nation unique.
It's like this fear of being absorbed, of losing those distinct cultural markers that define a people.
Precisely. And that's what makes it so interesting. It forces us to ask, what does it actually mean to be Hungarian? What are the core values, the shared experiences, the cultural touchstones that, bind Hungarians together, even as they're part of this larger European community?
You've given our listeners a lot to think about. As they continue to learn about Hungary's journey, what are some key takeaways they should keep in mind?
I think the most important takeaway is just to appreciate the complexity of history. It's not this simple linear progression, right? It's messy, full of contradictions, full of unexpected turns.
And each nation's history, especially one as rich and turbulent as Hungary's, shapes how they see themselves, how they see their place in the world.
Absolutely. Understanding the past is crucial to understanding the present. And the choices that nations make, both individually and collectively, that's what shapes the future.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into a truly fascinating chapter of history.
It's been my pleasure. And to our listener, I encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning. There's always more to uncover beneath the surface.
Our podcast discussions are based on our eBook, Hungary's Hall of Fame in a Nutshell. History, literature, art, music, science, sport. Scan the QR code or check the link in the description to download your copy of Hungary's Hall of Fame in a Nutshell. As a special bonus, you'll also receive the Illustrated Companion, featuring over 100 detailed illustrations to visually enrich your understanding of the book's content. Thank you for watching.